Wow, thank you all for coming tonight. This is great. I like to come out to the Pacific Northwest. I got introduced to the rain, so now I know basically everything about it. I got here, I'm not kidding, actually, I got here and I looked on my phone last night after I got checked in the hotel and it said, expect rain tomorrow, and I was like, really? I'm just joking, but I really am glad to be here. I'm very grateful to be here. I'm going to set a timer because I got to protect you people. You don't know your danger. Where's stopwatch? Okay. So I'm very grateful to get to speak here at Father's House. I'm very grateful to speak in a church. I never take this for granted. I think it's a very special opportunity. So thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for trusting me with standing up here. This is a very important place for all of you in your community, and I don't take that lightly. So I'm supposed to talk to you about communism in the church. I might adjust. We'll see how it goes. I might adjust the title a little bit to be more honest about what I'm going to talk about. I might talk about communism and fascism in the church. But those are two bad words, communism and fascism, and they both reflect collectivism. But what I actually want to talk to you guys about primarily, and I don't want to overwhelm you. I know the pastor earlier in the service today said that you'll be intellectually stimulated, and that was a euphemism because this might be a little academic. But I want to talk to you guys about how, without getting all into all the weeds, I want to talk to you guys about how your perception, which I'm sure you've heard and I'm sure a lot of you feel, and many of you have become aware of, that this is a spiritual battle more than it's any other kind of battle, that perception's correct. So I want to talk to you about what it means that this is a spiritual battle, which is maybe not quite what you expected, but what I want to share with you effectively is my research over the past few years, not just into the history and the nuts and bolts of communism and how it works, but rather how communism actually represents a religion. And this is a thesis that communism is a religion that the Supreme Court was met with and rejected in the 1950s. It decided that communism was not a religion. I believe that the court was in error in making that decision. The usual justification that communism's not religious is that it's a political theory or that it's an economic theory. It means communal ownership of the economy or the means of production. So therefore, it's economics. It's economics and politics, I guess. It's not religion, but that is a misunderstanding of what Marx put forth. It's a misunderstanding of Karl Marx's goals. Marxist communism, at the very least, is religious. It's possible, I suppose, if you want to gather together and form a commune. I guess we're in the right place where I can say Chaz or something like that. If you want to form a commune and live in a communal way, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious devotion. It could just be a cult. That was a joke, but as it turns out, when we get to Marx, it's not. It's not just a commune. It's not just people trying to live like one big, happy, extended family. It's something fundamentally different. In fact, Marx has a treatise. He wrote, just to give you some historical perspective, I'll give you some dates. There's no quiz. You don't have to remember the dates. But I just want to tell you when things were happening for some get your bearings. So Marx wrote his arguably most famous work, which is the Communist Manifesto, in 1848. And he published his second most famous work, which is Kapital, or as you often have heard it for the original German, Das Kapital, in 1867. So before all of this, before the Communist Manifesto, he wrote a series of manuscripts while he was in Paris. They're sometimes called the Paris manuscripts. That tells you where they were written. He didn't title these, as it turns out. He wrote them in 1844, so they're sometimes called the 1844 manuscripts. And then they're also known as the economic and philosophic manuscripts, which tells you what they're about. So you have three different titles, because he didn't actually give them a title, that were written 4 years before the Communist Manifesto. And in that, he talks about this idea of a commune, which actually was tested and tried during the French Revolution, which was in the 1790s. He actually talks about, there's a guy, his name was Gracchus Babeuf, who was an outright socialist, and he had actually organized a commune in France. It's not the famous Paris commune that was 100 years later, or 80 years later. It was, but he organized a commune, and they kind of ran a sort of communist thing during the French Revolution. And as it turns out, by the end of the French Revolution, this Babouf character was so radical that he wanted things to go even further than it was, so they took him and they cut his head off, and that ended his experiment with communism. But Marx looked back at that and he called it crude communism. And he was scathing about crude communism. That's not what Karl Marx was putting forth. The idea that we all live in a commune and share everything like one big happy family or one big giant dysfunctional marriage, the idea that that's how it's supposed to work, he said, is crude communism. It doesn't have the essential ingredient. And what happens when you do that, he says, is exactly what you got during the French Revolution. You end up with a low standard of living. You end up with people doing really brutal manual labor, hard work all day to just barely get by with, like I said, very low standard of living, bad living conditions, bad food, barely enough, everything going bad. And in particular, he pointed out that the women were very badly mistreated in exactly the way that you can imagine, as they became communal property as well. And you can imagine how bad this goes. So Marx said, that's not it. That's not it. He says that that's communism as the hatred of private property. And that's not what communism is about. He said what communism is actually about is, and I quote, the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement. Now that's very highfalutin language, but it's also very religious language. His first claim there is that that private property itself is a form of humans estranging themselves from who they really are. Human self-estrangement. So we're going to transcend, we're going to go beyond, that's a religious word. We're going to transcend private property, so we're going to adopt a complete new system of values, aka a religion, in which the idea of owning private property, or property that you can exclude other people from using and having, that's what makes it private. It's called the fundamental right to exclude. That's legally what it's called when you have private property. You can say, no sir, this is mine and you can't have it. That's what makes it private property. No sir, this is mine and I don't even want you to use it right now, even though I'm not using it. Fundamental right to exclude. Now I'll just point out with the woke movement that we're all dealing with, which I call woke Marxism, that we're all dealing with, what's one of their primary values? Inclusion. Trying to overcome the fundamental right to exclude. They want a more inclusive economy, a more inclusive space, inclusive this, inclusive that. They're trying to overcome the fundamental right to exclude that goes along with private property, because the goal is to transcend private property to a different kind of property, which Marx very confusingly called individual property, but it's actually also described as commonwealth. In other words, it's common property that an individual happens to be using right now, and that's what he means by individual property. So Klaus Schwab puts this as, you will own nothing and you will be happy. Everything that you have, you will rent or stream, and it'll all be delivered by drone. That's an actual World Economic Forum video from 2016 when they hit their high water mark thinking they were going to take over the world before Donald Trump became president. So here we are, it's a positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement. And when you hear that, human self-estrangement, what Karl Marx is saying is there's something that it means to be human. And the idea of private property, which boils down to the fundamental right to exclude from somebody else, removes us from who we really are. So Karl Marx is not laying down an economic doctrine. He's laying down a religious doctrine. And that doctrine is answering the question, what does it mean to be a human being? That is not an economic question. You might argue that it's a philosophical question, but it is not an economic question. And what he says in the next part, he says it's the positive, communism is the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and therefore a complete return of man to himself in his social, which is to say his human nature. So what Karl Marx is saying is that the true human nature, well, who we really are as people, is that we're socialists. But because of private property, we forgot that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get over private property. We're not just going to hate it like the communes. We're going to get over private property. We're going to positively transcend private property. We're going to have new values that go beyond private property ownership. We're all going to have one big dysfunctional marriage where everybody shares everything with everybody else. And in fact, in this exact same description, a few paragraphs before, that's precisely how he describes it. That's exactly how he describes it, comparing it to the mistreatment of women in Gracchus Babeuf's communes in Paris. And he says that won't work. It has to work like a marriage. It's the same kind of transcendence as you have in marriage. Now, you guys are in a church, and I'm willing to bet that most of you see marriage as a religious article. That under God two become one flesh, and that this is in some sense a religious mystery, how two people become one with one another in the sense that they don't withhold from one another any longer, and they treat each other as one flesh. Right? Karl Marx's economic doctrine is that everybody's supposed to do that with everybody else all the time, and that's a true return to who we really are, and it's what makes us human in the first place. That is what Marxism is actually about. That is what Marxism is predicated on. That is a religion. So what is this religion of Marxism? I think you're going to laugh when I tell you the best boiled down expression. I don't want to use all, I gave you your intellectual stimulation, Pastor. Now let's put it in Valley Girl speak. The Valley Girl speech version of the religion of communism, of Karl Marx's communism, is being able to see what can be unburdened by what has been. So in 1852, I'm in a pulpit, so I can't tell you why that's funny. But you all know, in 1852, Karl Marx wrote he wrote a lot. In fact, Karl Marx didn't want to get a job. Let me give you the dish on Karl. Everything Karl did boils down to that he thought he was really smart and he was really important and everybody should love him for the stuff that he writes, and he shouldn't have to get a real job because he's writing important contributions to people, and he doesn't want to do real contributions to people or a real contribution to an economy. And so he writes a lot. In fact, he writes an awful lot. He wrote so much that his mother famously one time remarked, Karl writes a lot about capital. It would be nice if he sometimes earned some. That's a true story as related by Paul Kenger, who is a university professor who has done a stellar biography of Karl Marx called The Devil and Karl Marx that will show you just how evil this man really was, and religious in his motivations. But in 1852, he wrote this thing. This is all a very fancy title. It's called the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. So Louis Bonaparte is Napoleon Bonaparte's grandson. He's being installed as king, emperor, or whatever of France, and Karl Marx is very unhappy, and so he writes this thing. And what he says, remember, we're trying to talk about how communism can be boiled down to able to see what can be unburdened by what has been, plus a complete return of mankind to being socialist, because that's who he really is. So what Karl Marx says is that men make history. So what does it mean to be human? It means that we're history makers. We're the beings who make and move history. And for Karl, history had a beginning point, which was in primitive tribal communism, and it has an end point, which is in global universal communism. And so men's job is to move history forward or backward through time until it gets to that end point in communism, which is like literally bringing the kingdom into being on earth by man, for man, in open defiance of God. A return to the Garden of Eden is what communism actually is. An open defiance of God. This is the vision. Communism is that state. And so he says men make history. We are the agents that move time itself in terms of what it means to have a society. But he says we don't make it under conditions that we choose. He says men make history, but they do not make it under conditions of their own choosing. And he says that the weight of history that's gone past so far, of past history, weighs on the mind of the living like a nightmare. And then he goes into a long digression about two different kinds of revolutions. There are the revolutions that take their inspiration from the past, he says. And they think of some great past era, a golden era, or they think of some great, king or hero or, general or something like that. And they take their inspiration and they mold themselves after that, and we're going to get the good times back. And he says, but the revolutions of the 19th century, those are socialist revolutions, he says they're of a different character. They don't draw their inspiration from the dead ghosts of the past, but from a vision of the future. So what communism is saying is men make history, but unfortunately, they don't do so based on their own choosing, because the conditions, their historical conditions they live in, are given to them. And it weighs on their minds like a nightmare. So in other words, men are burdened by what has been. That's the Valley Girl version of it. But on the other hand, revolutions for socialism draw their inspiration from an ideal future, unlike the revolutions that look to the past. In other words, they are able to see what can be. The whole program of Marxism boils down to the Marxists believing that they themselves can see what can be so that humanity can be unburdened by what has been in their historical conditions up to that point. And it's Kalama. Same letters, different order. It's a common mistake I learned here in the PNW. I just learned that yesterday. I was like, I can't stay there. This is going to go badly. And I said, oh, no, it's spelled different. Okay. The religion of Marxism, though, really does boil down to that exact idea, that we should be unburdened by the chains of history and able to see a utopia. Like I already told you, we can see man entering back into Eden triumphant, again, on his own terms in open defiance of God. That's the idea. That's the spiritual war that's being waged. And the question is, how does it work? And I'm not going to talk too much more about Karl Marx. He says it starts with the abolition of private property, but that it also requires this qualitative change in who you are, such that your sense organs, your eyes, your ears, and so on, become socialist eyes, socialist ears, that see the world in a fundamentally different way. Doesn't that just sound like a ripoff of Christianity? It is a ripoff of Christianity. It's just a total ripoff of Christianity where you take out the Christian part and you put in socialist in place of it, and then here you go. And then you make everything evil. You replace all your virtues with vices and all your vices with virtues, and now you're in business. You got to break the 7 seals by violating the 7 deadly sins all the time, especially pride and envy. That's how you do it. There's deep magic there in terms of occultism that's underlying Marxism that I'm not going to get into tonight, but that's genuinely how you do it. So the point of how it works in practice is that you go and you sow what I just said, pride and envy. You go and you sow division and enmity and hatred. If we wanted to speak religious because we're in a church, not my business, but we'll just do it, is that you bring a spirit of enmity and division into the world. You do this intentionally. And I'll tell you that while Karl Marx did an okay job with it, Vladimir Lenin did a far better job as he established with his Bolshevik party, the Soviet Union, the first communist state, the USSR. Stalin did a far, far better job after Lenin died and he took over, one of the most brutal people in all of history. But this was perfected. This spirit of enmity, division, and hatred was perfected by Mao Zedong and the People's Republic of China. And so what Mao did actually was very simple. He knew he needed total compliance, because here's the idea. Marx had this idea called the inversion of praxis. That's, again, highfalutin, complicated terminology that basically means that people conform to the society that they live in. His idea was that you go out and you do activism, that's praxis, and then you change society, and the way that society is has conditions that brainwash you to think this is how it is, and that's the inversion of praxis. Well, what Lenin and Stalin and Mao realized was if they can seize the means of production of society, not of economics, of society itself, of men's historical conditions, then they seize the means of production of man. They seize the means of production of man at the level of his soul, who he is, what kind of person he is, how he sees himself, what his values are. And if you want to seize the means of production of man, if you want to induce the inversion of praxis to achieve socialism, what you do is you force people to live in a socialist hellhole. And they'll think, well, this is just the way that it is. And they'll be socialized. This is normal. This is the same thing that we're dealing with today with the woke. If you force enough people to affirm transgender, then transgender is true. This isn't about a handful of sadly mentally ill adults who don't know how to handle their problem with any other mechanism, so they decide to undergo a sex reassignment surgery and try to live a quiet life and deal with their issue the best way that they can in help with their various health professionals. Transsexualism was that. Transgenderism is different. It's fundamentally different because transgenderism requires what transsexualism doesn't: affirmation. A man can become a woman in transgender ideology in the moment when society all agrees that if a man says he's a woman, then he is. It requires your consent. It requires your affirmation. And when everybody believes that it's real, that's the idea of the inversion of praxis. When everybody believes that the socialist utopia is around the corner, then it is, but not a minute before. And everybody has to believe it with all their heart, all their soul, all their mind, and all their strength. They have to, or it won't work. And so what Mao did was he said, well, we're going to get compliance out of people, and here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to put forth the deal, whatever the policy is. Let's use this one. Here's a policy that Mao didn't particularly use, but he could have. When everybody gets vaccinated, we'll open the economy back up. It could have been a different issue. It could have been when everybody catches 10 rats and turns in their tails or whatever, because he had his anti-pest campaign. Guess what people did to get around the anti-pest campaign? So Mao's anti-pest campaign with rats was that if you wanted to be able to get food that week, you had to bring however many 7 or 10 or whatever rat tails to the communist official and turn them in, and then they'd give you your meal card so you could go get your food at the canteen. Guess what happened? Anybody have any guesses as to what happened? They started breeding rats. That's right. So the rat problem got way worse because people were just taking a shortcut. What a surprise that didn't work out. People, instead of going and hunting a dwindling number of rats, just started breeding them and cutting their tails off and selling them on the black market to people. What a shocker. Government solves no problems. But here's what Mao did, is he said, here's what we're going to do. Everybody, we're going to pretend Mao had a vaccine campaign. Somebody's going to fact check me on this, and they're not going to get it, and I'm going to get bowled over for it. I don't care. You know what I'm saying, and they can figure it out from the context if they bother. I'm going to totally President Trump myself here. So Mao said when everybody gets the vaccine, he didn't really say this, P.S., when everybody gets the vaccine, we'll open the economy back up. I'm trying to make a point here. And then what he says is, it's real simple. Some of you people are doing great. Some of you are doing what you're supposed to. We're all in this together. You are part of a group of people that we will call the people. You're the responsible ones. However, some people are dragging their feet. They aren't sure. They're afraid. They don't know. Other people refuse. And now we're going to have a pandemic of the unvaccinated. We're going to have a long winter of disease and death. And all of you who are making your sacrifice to get your vaccine, to wear your mask, to do what you're supposed to, are doing it for nothing because this small group of counter-revolutionaries refuses to do what they should. So they're bad people. This is how you summon a demon of division and enmity and hatred into a population. Because everybody who got that vaccine, who really, really wanted it, is probably going to be a bully anyway. Everybody who got it and didn't really want it, but it was a condition of their employment or something to do with their family, or they got pressured into it against their better wishes, they didn't know, Every one of those people made a sacrifice, and they knew it. And just like Jordan Peterson said when he got it because he believed they would give him his freedom back if he did it. Turns out, Marxists always lie. The freedom was not given back. It will not be given back. But those people who sacrificed by doing what they were told sold a piece of their soul, and they feel that. And so when it's now these people's fault who won't go along with it, they become what Mao called them, the enemies of the people. So the people who comply are the people. That's literally what he called them. And the people who refuse to comply or drag their feet are the enemies of the people. See, George Floyd died under Mao's watch, and he said, we're going to be anti-racist in this country. We're all going to be anti-racist. As a matter of fact, Mao did do this. He said we're going to overcome Han chauvinism instead of white supremacy. He did exactly critical race theory. But he says, George Floyd has died, we're going to be an anti-racist country. But some small, selfish portion of the population refuses to get on board with whatever it is, reparations or whatever other policy, because they're racists. They probably support President Trump because he's racist. There's, in fact, an epidemic, a public health crisis of racism in this country. And all of you people who are trying, you're donating money to BLM, you're doing what you're supposed to, we're not going to get an anti-racist country because the small group of deplorable racists won't go along. And guess what you get when you do that, Mao Zedong? You get hatred, division, and enmity in a population. This is what Marxism was designed to conjure, a spirit of hatred, division, and enmity. The people versus the enemies of the people. Mao created an identity politics. This isn't doing this weird riff that I've been doing that is ahistorical and going to get me rolled over on the internet. No more like making it colorful. Mao created a real identity politic based on communist theory. The identity politics we call intersectionality is that same program. Mao divided the people into different categories of people. There were the workers and the peasants. They carry hammers and sickles. And then there were the revolutionary martyrs who died for the cause, the revolutionary soldiers who fought in his People's Liberation Army, the revolutionary cadres who led the charge in the people. Revolutionaries, 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 and some tokens that they pretend to care about but you can't become. And then they were coded red for communist. They were the good people. The people, as a matter of fact. The enemies of the people were coded black. And they were rich farmers. You didn't actually have to be rich. You just had to be barely richer than somebody else. Or they pretended because they had quotas to fulfill. Most of them were dirt poor. Rich farmers, landlords, and then you have those economic monsters. Then you have a suite of demons. You had counter-revolutionaries, something he called bad elements, bad influences. I think we call them conspiracy theorists or something. And then to just make a really good fine point of it, the last category he designated as the bad people were right wing. The entire right wing. All conservatives. And those were the demons. And I use this language, monsters and demons, because one of his generals in the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in 1966 published in June a very famous article called Sweep Away the Monsters and the Demons. I think it's Sweep Away All Monsters and Demons. And so you had to get rid of these bad actors in society, and you have these good actors. Well, you can't go become a worker or a peasant unless you get sent to the gulag. They didn't count it. It's not like you could just start working at a factory, maybe join the party. You actually had to become one of these revolutionaries. You had to adopt the party line in order to count as a good person. Now let's look at the identity politics of today. So on the communist seat, the woke team, what do you have? Coded woke. Well, you have women, sort of, sometimes, depends on the day right now. Depends on the self-identification status, depends on if they're fighting back. You have women, you have racial minorities, you have sexual minorities. Sometimes they pretend to care about poor people, but not really. You have gender minorities. You have mentally ill. And then you have allies, activists, transgender, queer theorists, actually, queer identities. These are revolutionary identities. Then on the other side, you have, in the kind of monsters category, you have men, you have straight people, you have white people, you have native citizens, as opposed to, say, a migrant is the word that we're supposed to use for an illegal alien. Lots of euphemisms. And then you have racists, transphobes, homophobes, sexists, misogynists, conspiracy theorists. We could just, deplorables. We could go down the list. Anti-maxer, anti-vaxxer. Did I say those right? Masker, vaxxer. Didn't do what you were told her. And they have to sweep away all the monsters and demons. So how are you going to sweep them away? Well, it becomes a condition of your employment. Becomes a condition to fit in society. Becomes a condition to eat in a restaurant. You can take your mask off after you sit down, sir. It makes total sense. Virus, yes. Virus, no. Safe from virus. Marked safe from virus. I'm just kidding. You actually have to be sitting. It doesn't count. People in wheelchairs, mask, yes. All the time, it's mobile. I don't know. I don't make the rules. They made up the rules so that we would hate each other. And look at those lines. So all white people are somehow implicated with racism. And all straight people are somehow implicated within homophobia and maybe transphobia. And all men are implicated in patriarchy and the hatred of women. This is the logic of Maoism. And what is it? It's nothing but a evil spirit of enmity, hatred, and division. And all you have to do if you're Mao, after you create this identity politics division, is you say, hey, look, communism's right around the corner. We're almost there. We're almost there. 3 more years of sacrifice and we have it. Work hard for 3 years to achieve the goal was a slogan in China under Mao. Work hard for 3 years to achieve the goal. We're almost there. And we would get there except for all of these spies and counter-revolutionaries and espionage and people that are undermining our attempt, so we have to destroy them. Lenin said very clearly, following Marx, that the true purpose of Marxism, he wrote this in State and Revolution in 1917, explaining what the point of a true Marxist state is. He said that the point, what actually makes a Marxist, what truly distinguishes an actual Marxist from a mere communist, is that they understand that the state will be ruled by something called a dictatorship of the proletariat. And it will use absolute force for one purpose and one purpose only, which is to destroy class enemies. It's going to stamp out every single backwards person, every single racist, every single transphobe, every single rich farmer. Doesn't matter which model, Western identity politics, Mao's identity politics, Stalin's identity politics, Lenin's identity politics. It doesn't matter which model. We're going to find the class enemies, the bourgeois elements, the selfish people who see themselves as individuals. And what can an individual do? Fundamentally exclude you from the use of their property. And we are going to use the full weight of the apparatus of the state to crush and destroy those enemies. Because here's how communism believes you build the kingdom of God on earth, or how you erect Eden by man and for man. This is how they believe. They believe that in order to do this, every single person has to be on board in the same way that if we were standing here in this church doing a wedding ceremony and I said my vows to my wife and she said her vows back to me, that we become one flesh, every single person has to have what he called a qualitative change from within that transforms who he is to understand his true social nature. And so here's what happens in practice. When this BS, to use a term of art, doesn't work, there must be somebody whose heart didn't change yet. So you have to go find them. You have to go test them. You have to get rid of them, re-educate them, destroy them. and you set up witch hunts. Neighbors turn against neighbors. Friends turn against friends. Parents turn against children. And much, much, much more frighteningly, children turn against parents. And the experience of every totalitarian regime, which has always created a youth division, whether it's Hitler's youth, whether it's Lenin's, what were they called, Young Octoberists or whatever they were called, and then Mao's Red Guard, is that the younger they are, the more brutal they are. Turns out that prefrontal cortex matters for impulse control. And you whip up a child to overcome their normal empathy, not to beat their, say, teacher to death, and they learn to do it, and they have no off switch, and they become the most terrifying thing in the world. And Mao understood this and weaponized this, and so did Lenin, and so did Stalin, and this is the spirit of evil that communism brings in, because their belief is that it only brings about the turn to the, I'm telling you, reconstituted Garden of Eden on man's terms in open defiance of God. You only get that when everybody is fully convicted to this new belief system. That's what totalitarianism is. That's what collectivism truly is. It's everybody has to believe the same thing, and it's whatever the leaders happen to say everybody has to believe. And it will work when that happens. Now, we have a word in English for organizations with religious beliefs that are perhaps a bit wacky, but not always, that treat their membership in that way. They're called cults. Communism is a cult. It's the largest cult that has ever started on the planet, and it is the largest cult that's ever taken over our countries. And it is running rampant. So when you encounter your average woke person out in the street, I want you to remember, I know you're in Washington, I know you encounter this. The vast majority of them are ideologically possessed by a cult religion. They are victims of cult brainwashing. And that can bring you back to your faith of loving your enemies. Because it's very important that we have a change of heart in this country if we want to get out of this mess. But you've got to understand that what this is fundamentally this spiritual battle. It's truth versus idealism, where they've imagined, you ever read their stuff, reimagine schools, reimagine the government, reimagine equity from like last year when we reimagined it before. Reimagine church, reimagine belief, reimagine everything. Reimagine, because in their imagination they see the ideal. They see what can be. All we have to do to get there is kill everybody, unburden from what has been, so that we can get there. And this is the faith that we are competing against. So Marxists, very famously, this is a big mistake. A lot of people, religious people in particular, make this mistake. A lot of people say Marxism is atheist. And that's the key thing about it, it's atheist. Marx said it was atheist, and Lenin forced what he called state atheism, but it's not. It's profoundly religious, and its hatred for other religions is exactly what I just said. It is a hatred for other religions. It has to get the other religions off the table in order to install itself. So its hatred for Christianity, which is only really outstripped by its hatred for Judaism, which is bottomless. If you don't believe me, go look up. You'll think you're reading Hitler. Go look up Karl Marx on the Jews. No, sorry, that's somebody else. Karl Marx on the Jewish question. There's an essay that he wrote early in his career. See what Karl Marx had to say about Jews. You'll think you're reading Hitler, right to the bottom. It's that vicious. And the reason that he hates Jewish and Christian faith is because they are in the way. True faith gets in the way of false faith. He says very clearly in that same economic philosophic manuscript I already told you about, very clearly, that atheism is barely even a beginning. It's not communism. It has absolutely no altruism to it. It's false. It's just a starting place. I want you to think of it this way. If you had a field and you wanted to grow corn in the field, but the field's full of grass, what do you have to do first? You have to plow the grass. Then you can plant the corn. Atheism is just plowing the grass out of the way so you can plant the communism. He doesn't use that metaphor, but that's exactly how he describes what his program is about. It is a separate and different religion, which means it's actually after your soul. Which is why Charlie Kirk and I very often have said on stage that communism goes after three things. It goes after family, faith, and property. Those are the three things it goes after. Those are the three things it targets the most. Yes, it tries to take over the institutions. Why? Because it wants to use the institutions to create the historical conditions that define man at the level of his soul. But what's in the way? The biggest safeguards of a man in his soul are his family, where his roots are, where he's come from. What is it, the fifth commandment? Which commandment is it? Honor your parents. Fourth commandment, sorry. Honor your parents. Honor your mother and father so that you may live long in the land that you dwell, right? So you have to get that out of the way. You have to teach them to hate their parents. You have to teach them to reject their parents. You have to teach them that their parents are actually a cause of most of their problems. Now think about all the pop psychology that every millennial grew up on. It's your parents' fault. Your parents probably messed you up. It was in every TV show and movie people watched for decades. Yeah, it's probably your parents. Oh, well, I had mom issues. You know, yeah, my mom, you know, da-da-da. Every show talked about how it was always their mom messed them up, or their dad, well, the big Christian conservative dad who's going to disown his gay son, right? That's the whole basis for half of the psychopathic inclusion that a lot of people go on. They're going to prove how inclusive they are by destroying physically, emotionally, and sexually and mentally their children with trans ideology in order to prove how inclusive they are. That they're not the evil dad from the 90s who would disown their gay son. They're overcompensating. That's the psychological disease that they're facing there. And what this is all about is that they have to destroy the family because the family is a guarantor of a place where you can go back and remember who you are, where you came from, what you stand for, what your values were. It's all about getting everything, the individual has to be separated from everything that their soul is based in so that they can have it transformed into communism. Through what? Hatred, envy, pride. And it's all done through hatred, enmity, and division. That's why families are split apart right now. Everybody knows it. I bet every family in here has at least one person, or almost more than half, probably 3/4, has at least one family member who doesn't talk to you anymore. Almost every family in America is damaged by this in just a few years, 5 years. Almost every family. Well, then what? Faith. I mean, I don't have to elaborate. I already said about the digging up the field so you can plant communism, right? They've got to get faith out of the way. They have to attack faith so that they can plant communism. Why? How do you get spiritual enrichment? How do you get spiritual clarity? Where do you learn discernment? Through your faith, if it's a true faith. If they want to implant a false faith, they have to get the true faith out of the way. So they go after family, they go after faith, because those things are intimately related to their access to your soul. And then property. This is American as pie, or as apple pie, guys. Listen up. If you don't understand why the Constitution is so important, you've got to understand this. One of the fundamental revolutionary ideas of the United States of America, by the way, the inside of my jacket is the Constitution here. Okay? You can't see it, but it says, "We the people" under the collar. I take this seriously. One of the things about America that's so magical is that we secure the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not the Constitution, that's the Declaration, I know. But the Declaration is saying the pursuit of happiness because that's how John Locke described what property allows you to do. So it's the secured rights to life, liberty, and property that do what? Are these, we're endowed by our Creator with these, with certain inalienable rights, among these being life, liberty, and we'll just say property for the moment. What does that, why do those matter? Well, if they can't kill you for your beliefs, and they can't lock you up for your beliefs, and they can't put you in poverty for your beliefs, then they can't force you to believe something different. If you want freedom to believe, if you want freedom to be able to choose grace, if you want freedom to live righteously, not because you are compelled to obey a tyrant, but because it's the right thing to do, which is what God actually calls every Jew and Christian to do in the Bible, you have to have religious freedom. And you can't have religious freedom unless you have the ability to safeguard your private property rights. And the founders of this country and their philosophical predecessors in Scotland, not in France, not in Germany, in Scotland, under something called Scottish common sense realism, in which John Locke was brought up, in which Thomas Jefferson and James Madison studied, they understood this. What was Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet called? Common Sense. And they understood this, that if you can be deprived of your life, your liberty, or your property, any of those, then you can have your belief compelled, and then that means some man is usurping the authority of God that he does not have to tell you how you must believe. Not as a matter of conviction of your heart, not as a matter of transformation of your heart, not as a matter of your own thought processes or any experience of your life, but because somebody else said you have to. And that's what they rob from you. So if you want to get to somebody's soul, we'll assume that they can't easily, until they take power, take away your life and liberty. They certainly take those away later. But when they're on the attack, they go after what? Family, faith, and property. And the reasons they do that is because they need to transform people's souls. Children don't have very much property, so they go after family and faith primarily, especially family. And what they do, and then I'll kind of shift gears into how we can be inspired about this, but I need you to understand this is a spiritual battle. What they do is they learned in Soviet Union that you can't smash out Christianity. For those of you that saw Beneath Sheep's Clothing, Julie Bailing went over there. She wrote the manuscript for the book and the film. She went over there in the 90s, right after the Soviet Union fell. She was LDS, and she was on her mission, and she talked to thousands of people while she was in Russia. She said at least 1,000 people, do you believe in God? She asked every single person she met in Russia in the 1990s, do you believe in God? This is right after the Soviet Union fell. One person only said no. The Soviet Union was not able to smash out belief in God. People might have lied in public. People might have denied it, but they were not able to smash out belief. And Lenin actually, in the 1920s, already knew this. Stalin certainly knew it. So what they erected was something called a registered church. They created a fake church. You still go to church. It still has priests, but they preach communism instead of Christianity. But they don't just preach communism. It's not naked communism. It's communism dressed up like a priest. It's communism dressed up as a pastor. It's communism dressed up as a rabbi in the temple. It's a communism that's dressed up as a monk in the Buddhist temple. And this is exactly what this spiritual war is trying to do right now. They are trying to change the values of Christianity, of Judaism, of Islam. It doesn't matter the faith. Every single one. All to reflect these new values of communism, which they've called sustainability and inclusion. Every faith is meant to worship those. Look at not to pick on anybody, but look at the Pope. Not picking on any particular religion. I bring up the Pope because he's a member of an organization called the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. The Council for Inclusive Capitalism. There's your inclusion right there. Along with Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, and along with about 700 of the biggest CEOs on the planet. Their goal is to completely transform the business environment to make these values of inclusion, for some reason tied to Vatican Catholic faith, get infused into all the workers. The goal is to get people to adopt new values. You guys got this full blast during COVID, no doubt. What did you hear? Loving your neighbor means wearing a mask. Loving your neighbor means not visiting your loved ones when they're dying in the hospital. Loving your neighbor means getting your vaccine because we told you to. Jesus said, love your neighbor. Except that's not, I'm not going to preach, but that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor. Two pieces to the commandment. Love the truth first. Love what's right first. Then love your neighbor from that. And if you miss the first part, you're going to do it wrong. You're going to fall into suicidal empathy. It's very important. You'll hear another subversion of Christianity in Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus is saying, I'm going to send you out among ravening wolves, so you need to be as wise as serpents and gentle as doves. and the subversion comes along and says, hey, you know what you actually need to be? Jesus said be gentle. In other words, Jesus said be a doormat. Jesus said roll over. Jesus said affirm. He didn't say any of that. He said be as wise as serpents and gentle as doves, because I send you out among ravening wolves who intend to mislead you. You actually have to know what was really being said to understand it. But a subversion takes a part of it and puts it out of context, so you misunderstand it. And then you are practicing, to use a big word, deracinated Christianity, pulled out of its roots, and they transform it to face other values. That's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's happening, and that's why churches like this are thriving while others dwindle, because you are not doing it, or at least to the best of your ability to discern. Nobody's perfect. You do the best you can, and when you make mistakes, you humble yourself. I came to the service this morning. That was the whole point. You make mistakes, you humble yourself, you repent, and you move forward, do better. A lot of churches are not doing that, and they're paying the price. They're dwindling. They're shrinking. And the reason is because they're preaching a converted faith, and that's how they're trying to get in. I'm not here to preach to you about how you should do your religion. I'm here to tell you that the globalist monster is transforming the religions from within to get people who are Christian or whatever other religion keep worshiping wrongly. I'll tell you a story. So Charles Spurgeon, some people just love the guy. Some people have some issues with the guy. It's beside the point. I'm going to quote him. The quote's spot on. Charles Spurgeon said that discernment is not the difference between knowing right and wrong. It's knowing the difference between right and almost right. That's so important to understand, because here's the deal. This is real, taking off from, I forgot which airport, a Korean Air flight took off in the 1980s to go to Seoul, and they misset their compass by 1 degree. 1 degree, right? So this is correct. This is 1 degree. I think I turned more than 1 degree. You couldn't even see it, right? But because they flew the plane, 747 or whatever it was, 1 degree off course, it turns out that they crossed into Soviet airspace. The Soviets figured there's no way that a passenger plane would be so stupid as to fly into our airspace, so it must be a spy plane disguised as a commercial jet. Scrambled fighters shot it down, killed all 350 people on board. 1 degree off. Because here's the deal. If I walk in a straight line and I go where I'm going, fine. If I walk 1 degree wrong, I'm going more than 1 now, so it's more visible. What happens is after a couple hundred miles, you are 30 miles off course. So you've probably heard it before. How did we get here? Well, we got asked to move 1 inch. And we said, okay. And you got asked to move 1 inch. And we said, okay. And you got asked to move 1 inch. You said, okay. And then, sometime later, 2 decades later, we're 3 miles down the road and don't know how we got here. 1 inch at a time, right? If you deviate by 1 degree, 1 degree, every so many, 1 mile or whatever, you're off by 1 inch. And the next time you go a mile, you're off by another inch. And that's just 1 degree. So knowing the difference between right and almost right is the difference between everything. Because here's how this works. Things will start going wrong if you practice a subverted faith. And this is what the communists did. What happened with the communists when everything went wrong? There must be somebody out there who doesn't do it right, who's a subversive, who's an enemy. We have to find them and purge them. In fact, let's purge 1 out of every 1,000 people just to be sure. And we'll scare the crap out of everybody else so they get on board. That's what they did. Well, here's the deal. Same program. If you believe a little bit wrong, let's say it's wise as serpents, gentle as doves, right? And they say, no, you just have to be gentle. So you forget the wise as serpents part. You're among ravening wolves. You have no wisdom now. What's going to happen? Something's going to go wrong, right? So here's what they'll do. They take advantage of that situation. Stuff starts going badly. Why? Because you're affirming. You're doing what you shouldn't. You're not putting the truth first. You're not putting righteous first. You're just going along. Then what happens? Stuff starts to go wrong. And what do? Do they accept the blame for themselves? No. They externalize the blame onto their enemies. So what they're going to say is, hey, did you see that? What's gone wrong is that you're being gentle. You're being gentle. That's why all this stuff's going wrong. And you're like, yeah, it is. And now you've been subverted twice. You've lost both of Jesus' commandments. You're not gentle or wise now. The wolves are still there. That's how they subvert you twice. And that's why what you end up with is you get subverted into communist faith or communist belief, and things start going wrong, and eventually somebody says the problem is we're being too nice, and boom, fascism's on the table. And if they don't get you this way, they get you coming back. You've heard about the pendulum swinging? You should read what they write about the pendulum swinging. They don't say that the pendulum swings. They say that you direct the swing of the pendulum so that when it comes back, it hits your enemy. They plan the swing of the pendulum so that it doesn't come back to the same place, that it goes where they need it to go. So the pendulum's not going to swing, oh, it got far to the left. I guess this is left for you guys. It got far to the left. It's going to come way back to the right. That's good. It's about time. No. They make sure that when it comes back to the right, it goes wrong. They make sure that it goes not back to liberty, which is where a real swing back would go, is back to liberty, but to another tyranny, to fascism. And if you're not discerning, if you can't tell right from almost right, that's where you end up. And fascism ends in communism every time. You can say they're the same thing, but what happens is every country that goes fascist, a period of time goes by, everybody gets mad, they call it the right wing, and the left has all the power for another century. And every single formerly fascist country has been communist afterwards. When do you get back to liberty? Let's say that we say, well, we've got to throw out the Constitution to stop this monster. How do you get your Constitution back? Well, we're going to suspend it for 10 years, then we get it back. You think the guy you empower for 10 years is going to give you your freedom back? That's like Jordan Peterson getting a shot. I shouldn't make fun of Jordan, but that one's too good. That's too good. Okay, so besides being discerning, what do? Let me just tell you, you guys are in a fortunate place. I get asked a lot what to do. When I'm in churches, I'm just like, you have so many things. You have this huge community. You have this opportunity you brought me in, so I know you do it, to educate people in your community. Education is how you get discerning. You have to be able to spot the real from the false. That's going to require spiritual teaching. That's going to require teaching about the founding documents of this country and what this country was constituted in and what it means and what it's for. That's going to be teaching about history. That's going to be bringing in, you don't have to bring in lecturers. You guys can do it yourselves. Sit down and have, you have small group meetings or whatever. Sometimes have them about the Declaration of Independence. We're going to understand every word of this thing. Have it about the Federalist Papers. Get the young people involved in learning, and then the old people are like, man, I better learn this first so I don't look stupid. And now everybody's learning it. You can learn all of that. But basically, it's going to come down to a couple of very simple things. Number one, you have to have hope. And I mean that in the sense of Hebrews 11, hope and faith being roughly identical here. And I want to remind you that there's a way to know whether or not you actually have hope and faith, if you have faith in particular. Because courage is proof of faith. They say faith without works is dead. Well, what's the bridge between the faith and the works? Having the guts to do it. Having the guts to stand up and say, I believe in this, but it's going to be bad if I do it, so I'm going to do it anyway. So courage is proof of faith. So if you lack courage, fix your faith. And you think I'm preaching, I'm not. It can be faith in God. It can be faith in this country. It can be faith in your family. It can be faith, not in a prideful way, in yourself and the good things that you want to try to bring into the world, just like we had in the message this morning. You've got to love your country. You've got to understand where it came from. You've got to love the truth. You've got to love the good. You've got to love the beautiful. And I'm saying it that way. You have to love these things. And I mean this in the sense of the gospel. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy mind, all thy soul, and all thy strength. And then love your neighbor as yourself. You have to love the truth, the good, the beautiful, and your country. Why? What's different about loving it? Isn't speaking the truth enough? No, because eventually your courage is going to fail. Or you're going to see somebody else. They get pilloried for speaking the truth, and you're going to say, well, I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want any of that heat. And so you won't stand up for them. Or you're going to get lazy. You're like, well, I want to tell the truth, but it turns out it's hard to find out what the truth is. It takes a lot of digging. It's a lot of work, and you're going to get lazy. But if you love the truth, if you love beauty, if you love the good, You're going to pursue them. You're going to try to look for them. You're going to try to understand what they are. You're going to like them for what they are in and of themselves. You're going to speak them naturally because you don't know how not to, because you love that. You're going to back up other people in the same pursuits. So you're going to become leaders and supporters, not bench sitters and followers. And leaders and supporters are going to change this country, change this state, and save this country. Save everything. Save the world. Because if we lose America, we lose everything. Same thing with loving your country. It's very, very simple. If you love your country, you're going to find out what it's about, and you're going to defend it. You're going to find out what made America special, this radical idea that securing people's rights, that all men are created equal in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the law, that this is a radical departure from what any other nation has ever done. It's not about a king. It's not about an emperor. It's not about a cult of personality. It's not about anything like that. It's not about an ethnicity. It's about the idea that we can work for ourselves, govern ourselves, and that things will work out better the more of that we're able to do. So we're going to limit the power of government, which has no just authority except that which we consent to. You will understand, you'll spend time with those documents and learn it. And then when you end up in these dialogues or these arguments or these conversations about what things are, why this, why that, what's the other thing, you'll be able to articulate what matters and why it matters. You'll know where we came from, and you'll know where we're supposed to go. I ask young people sometimes, where do you see America ideally in 50 years? No idea. They've never thought of the question. They can't even picture the idea of a future of the country. They haven't thought about it. You should be thinking about that. Where should this country, what should we be achieving in 50 years or 20 years even? What should we be accomplishing? If you're young, if you're 20 now, when you're in your 40s and 50s coming into the prime of your civic engagement in a lot of aspects of your life, where do you want this country to be and what role do you want to have in that? These are real questions. If you love this country, you care about its future. The same way that you care about the future of your children, the same way that you care about the future of your spouse and everything else that you love. So that's very simple advice. The only thing I tell you practically is you guys are already engaged, you're already here, but stay engaged. Don't give up hope. Understand this, and I switch from the Bible to the Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry, Pastor. This is my favorite little inspirational story. It's kind of stupid, but it's really great. So I always feel like such a nerd because I don't know who's actually, I know that I'm in a church, so everybody's read their Bible. See, they've all read their Bibles. But I don't know who's read Lord of the Rings. Okay, well, very good, all right. Or you watched the movie, at least. So you guys all know there's a wizard, and I don't want to get all weird. There's a wizard named Gandalf, and I just need a little bit of here. And then there's these little guys called hobbits, right? And the hobbits go off on this adventure, but they're not really that with it all the time, especially the two cute ones, Merry and Pippin. And so they get kidnapped by orcs in a dramatic scene, and they get carted off to this forest, and here's where, we got wizards, we got little people, and now we've got tree people in the forest of Fangorn. And so they go there, and then the tree people get very upset by what they hear from the hobbits, and then they go and they destroy the evil wizard's fortress called Isengard. Okay, so that's a very short summary of a big plot part of Lord of the Rings with some spoilers. And so the wizard Gandalf describes this later this way. Here's what he says. He says, I think that the coming of Merry and Pippin to Fangorn Forest was like the loosing of two small stones that started an avalanche. And I think that's one of the most profound and important lines in that book. And there are a number of them. Because a lot of people think, who am I? I'm too small. What can I do? I'm not going to get into the mustard seed in the mountains thing here. Actually, I am. I'm mixing my books now. I'm too small, what can I do? Well, you can be the loosing of a small stone that might start an avalanche. You might kick 100 stones, and none of them start an avalanche, and the 101st does. So you have to just keep doing what your little thing is. Maybe it's raising your kids. Maybe it's showing up to things like this. Maybe it's backing some political candidate that you think has got the right ideas. Maybe it's stepping up and, making noise in your community. I'll tell you a story. Do you guys know who Billboard Chris is? Yeah, some. It's a kind of an internet thing. Chris Elston's his real name. He's just north of you. He's in the other Vancouver, not the South Vancouver, the real one. Just kidding. I didn't even know there was a Vancouver on this side. He's in the Canadian one. And so one day he was at lunch. Here he is. He's an investment guy. He's like a finance guy. He's making money. He's got a job, and somebody's telling him that kids are getting put on puberty blockers. And he's like, what? What's that? And the guy kind of describes it, and Chris is scratching his head. And he goes home, and he thinks this can't be real, so he Googles it. And puberty blockers they do exactly what it sounds like. Why would anybody do that? And he looks over at his two girls who are getting right about that age, and he's like, oh, hell no. And this man, almost single-handedly, has done more to transform the landscape. I mean, Chloe Cole probably beats him a little bit, but there's not many people who have done more to stop this menace of transgender manipulation and mutilation of children in the world than Chris. But Chris is doing this, yes, because of weird things about Chris, but because somebody at lunch kicked a stone and said the words puberty blockers. That's all it took. Somebody at lunch said, this isn't about Chris. This is about somebody saying puberty blockers to Chris. And so if you're willing to take that action and prove your faith with a little bit of courage and speak up and tell the truth, you're eventually going to say something to somebody that sends something going in their head, and the next thing you know, they're like Riley Gaines or something, making a huge difference. So maybe it's you, maybe you step up into the role, and maybe you're just the person who told Billboard Chris the words puberty blockers. But either way, you end up being the small stone that looses an avalanche. That is what you have to, you're not too small to make a difference. But the thing is you've got to have that courage, which is the proof of faith. And here's where we get to the mustard seed thing. Because if you have faith, the size even of a mustard seed, you can tell the mountain, move into the sea, and it will. You have to believe that you can make a difference for this country, for your children, for your grandchildren, for our future, for this state. And if you believe that and you act accordingly and you study and you tell the truth, you will. You will. Thank you for letting me come and tell you that. And I'll take questions as long as you don't kick me out.
All right. So if you have questions, not necessarily making statements or this is his moment of fame, not yours. But we would love for you to line up here. And especially questions that applies to many people or situations that would be helpful for many. Let's just line up here and let's do it. The quicker the questions, the more questions we can take. But yeah, so come on, line up here if you have any questions.
I won't be hurt if you don't. I get to go home sooner if you don't.
All right. Yeah. We have a wealth of a resource here, so make use of it. That's what I want to encourage you to. All right, Logan.
Thank you. My question has to do with the personal family members that are special operators in our military. What's their position on all this that you're saying, on our admiralty and the leaders and generals and the people who are ready to go out and die for our rights?
I am not in that group of people, so I can't speak directly. I have heard some things. I hear that it depends on the individual, of course. It depends also if you're talking statistically on views on the service. The Marines, as you might expect, are much more pro-America, aka our team, than the other services are on average, but they're all split, and I'm talking about both enlisted and officers, but not necessarily high-ranking officers. I don't want to necessarily name names, but does anybody think that General Milley is on our side at this point? I mean, so there are many of the highest offices in the armed forces are political offices primarily. That's how you eventually start climbing those ranks. I've heard that the special forces are virtually all on our side, but when we get to ranks like general, those are political operators as much as they are military officials, and they have swallowed, in many cases, a great deal of the Kool-Aid. I'm not going to point out who is what and what is who, but I am hopeful for an administration that might be able to start repairing the infiltration, which is significant but not catastrophic in our military, coming soon. And I'm hopeful that my friend Matt Lohmeyer, I wish he was here to answer your question better, but if you can look him up, his name is Matt Lohmeyer. He is the former Space Force commander, former Air Force pilot, who had, and his name's hard to spell, but Matt Lohmeyer is his name. He is a former Space Force commander and Air Force pilot who wrote a book outlining the way that this neo-Marxist ideology has infiltrated our military and was summarily dismissed from his duty. And President Trump just recently met with him on stage at one of his events and said that should he become president again in January, that Mr. Lohmeyer will be running a commission to help fix the military. And I know Matt personally and think he's fantastic and would be a great man for the job. So I encourage you to look up his work. There's another group called STARS, S-T-A-R-R-S. STARS is run by, if I remember correctly, a retired colonel, but it may be actually a retired general, and they are fully on our side. They would know much more about the contamination and ideological contamination and injury to our military than I would, but they're a great organization I've worked with in the past as well. So S-T-A-R-R-S, STARS, and Matt Lohmeyer are going to be peak resources for you on that. I wish I could tell you more. I'm nervous but not terrified, is my general sense of that picture. But I'm very concerned about some of the actions of the one general I named, among a couple others.
Thank you, Dr. Lindsay. My question is with regards to the right to choose abortion here in this country, and you know, do you see can you elaborate on how that ties into Marxism and that whole agenda, or does it at all? So, thank you.
Well, certainly, yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Certainly, I don't know if you've ever heard of a book called The Naked Communist, which was written by Cleon Skousen. In that book, Cleon Skousen lays out I think 48, if I remember the number correctly, principles or points of action for the Communist Party USA at the time, which would have been in the, I guess, 40s or 50s. And one of those points was, in fact, to encourage widespread abortion and make it as fully legal as possible. So it was certainly something that the communists saw as beneficial to their program. That said, it wasn't necessarily the battle that I think that is being fought currently after the overturning of Roe versus Wade, of course. It has been thrown to the states, and it's a states' decisions issue, which is at least partially in line with American federalist tradition. I am not going to, adjudicate on that, but certainly the fact of the matter is that the communists, for some reason that I don't actually know, decided that they would benefit from that. So what I see in particular in this particular election then is I see one side that's not communist and one side that is communist. So I see one side that has made controversial statements about abortion, and I see one side that aligns with a regime that historically has caused as much abortion as the state wants at state command. When I'm speaking specifically that under communism you get as much abortion as, and I don't mean access to, I mean if the state says you're not having another child, you're not having another child. So what you're choosing between in this election on that issue is somebody who has said things that are uncomfortable for most pro-life activists and an agenda that's tied to a machine that aborts by the largest numbers that it can get away with. And so it's a very ugly situation. Ultimately, honestly, this matters. This is a tangent, but since I talked actually about communism being a religion, let me actually point out that communism is a eugenicist religion in the sense that its goal is to seize production of man. The goal is to make man remember or realize or return to his true socialist nature. So if I am a freedom lover, maybe I'm defective. So they try to re-educate me. And if they can't re-educate me, then maybe they kill me because I can't be re-educated because I'm defective, right? So what it is it's not necessarily a eugenics program like you associate perhaps with the Nazi regime. It's a spiritual eugenics program. The goal isn't to selectively breed human beings for anything other than compliance. If you are an obedient person who listens to the government, then you get to carry on and have children, and if you don't, you're probably not going to be allowed to. And so communism, for whatever reason, has pushed, if you look at those goals, a lot of the goals include no-fault divorce, sexual promiscuity, and on and on and on, but also the abortion. I encourage you to look that up, to look up The Naked Communist and read it if you get the chance. It's long, it's detailed. Cleon Skousen was an unbelievable resource to this country a little over 3/4 of a century ago. But you can see for yourself there. I don't have a ton of detail in that particular aspect. But of course, the idea is to undermine family. The idea is to cause people to have trauma and injury that they can then wrap into a story. And I can tell you this. Let me actually explain to you that it is, it's very weird to do this here. I apologize. But I understand a lot of people want to start arguing the issue of abortion with me, and if that's anybody else's question, it's not going to be productive. That's not what this is for, and it's not anything to do with my position, which I'm not even going to tell you any position. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you how the left thinks about the issue of abortion because nobody understands it. And the left sees, communism included, sees life as having been imprisoned in conditions you don't like. For Marx, you've been imprisoned in historical conditions that were erected by the ruling and bourgeois classes that don't let you live your life the way you want to. So everybody in the world is in prison. The feminist view of abortion is that women are imprisoned by the fact of their fertility, so that they, at any time while fertile, can become pregnant and then have to rewrite the story of their life around that pregnancy and child. So any vision, any imagination, the imaginary of their lives that they had, has to be sacrificed in the moment of a pregnancy. So they are imprisoned in a world they do not want to live in by the fact of their fertility. So rather than seeing a potential birth or potential baby, a child, as a miracle, which is, I think, a very important disposition for people to have, they see a child, a baby, a pregnancy, as an incarceration. And so their logic on abortion, this up to and maybe even after birth stuff you're hearing, is that no woman should be imprisoned in a world she doesn't want to live in because of her fertility. And this is a fundamentally Marxist way of thinking about the world. And I'll go deeper than this. Marxism and feminism share in this, that they are actually, and this is a word a lot of Christians know and not all Christians know, it is a fundamentally Gnostic view of the world. The old Gnostic heresies, this is the spiritual battle that we're in. Marx didn't believe in a spiritual demiurge that imprisons humanity, that the secret knowledge of the true meaning of the gospel will set you free from by reading a secret Bible code. He believed in a social demiurge, an economic demiurge that controls the bourgeoisie, becomes the demon that controls everybody's life, and the knowledge that our true spiritual nature as socialists sets us free. Well, for the abortion activist who is a leftist, this isn't a generic, old school, pro-choice person. This is what we should actually call a pro-abortion activist on the left. They see the thing the same way. Their own fertility, the fact that they can become a mother, imprisons them into a life that was determined by others, possibly even the child that she might bring into the world. So she sees it as an incarceration by an evil demon, as opposed to seeing it as a miracle and an opportunity. And until you understand the true spiritual disease behind what the left is pushing with abortion, we're just going to go back and forth. And this is communist too. Because the communists want you to have the wrong argument all the time so that you're never touching the real one. You're not talking about the genuine spiritual malady of confusing an opportunity and a miracle for a curse. Because you're over here fighting about choice versus life. And you're not getting down to the fundamental brass tacks of what they actually believe. And that is a communist strategy. And so the most communist thing about the issue of abortion, in my opinion, actually, is again that spirit of enmity and division that it brings. The left knows that it's their winningest issue. And they also know that if they can provoke the right into taking a hard stance about it very publicly, that they're going to win elections. And they're going to keep power. And they're going to keep doing it. So they very cynically manipulate this. They very cynically develop this hatred for themselves in women and then weaponize it politically. And I mean, not to speak out of turn, but I can't think of something more satanic than that. And it doesn't have anything to do even with the action itself at that point. It's before the action. The spiritual disease precedes the activity. And if you don't understand how the left thinks about abortion, we're never going to stop them on this particular issue. So, thank you.
So I've grown up evangelical, and I've just come to realize, and I'm reading a book that shows how there's New Age ideas and concepts that have leaked into evangelicalism over the last 50 years. A lot of what you said about communism sounds like what I'm reading about, oneness and all that. I witnessed whatever that was on the day of St. Michael, and you just getting it from all sides, when all you did was like, hey guys, by the way, worship of St. Michael. So could you speak to the occultism, to that, how these institutions that we're seeing now started with these Gnostic ideas?
Yeah, thank you. If you don't know what the thing about St. Michael was, I discovered a psychological operation and got pretty well bombarded on the internet. And now there's a meme that I hate Catholics, which means I hate my grandma, so I don't. And all right, like calm down, people. So what actually happened was since y'all are not Catholics, you may not know there's a holiday in the Catholic calendar called Michaelmas, kind of like Christmas. It's the Mass of St. Michael. Like Christmas is the Mass of Christ, the way that Catholics organize things. And so St. Michael is the Archangel Michael is who they're actually referring to. And they have a prayer, which is a battle prayer that was written in the late 19th century, so about 150 years ago, to St. Michael that they frequently say on this holiday, although growing up Catholic, I never heard it said. Apparently John Paul II stopped it being said in most Catholic masses, but before that it was said in very many. I don't know the whole details. But anyway, President Trump actually tweeted a picture of St. Michael slaying the dragon and put St. Michael's prayer on Michaelmas this year. And this rankled my sensibilities because unfortunately what my job is to read the enemy's literature. And I have noticed for a long time that many of the organizations like the United Nations, UNESCO, the Fetzer Institute from which social emotional learning was invented, the occultists at the Fetzer Institute who inspired Robert Mueller from UNESCO who created Common Core, the Fetzer Institute it's in Michigan. It was established by a man named John Fetzer, who was an outright occultist. The original symbol for the institute was the Archangel Michael. They believed that they were summoning the Archangel Michael and channeling his spirit in order to get their inspiration for what direction that should take. And this was an explicitly, openly, avowedly occult organization that has organized a great deal of what's happening at the globalist level. So I said, hey, a gigantic weird push from our not very obviously religious president into a prayer to St. Michael that most Americans are not aware of is not a great idea necessarily, because there's another use that a lot of you might not know about. So it turns out that when you warn people, they shoot you, which it was really bad. It was a rough ride for the last few weeks. And so the occultism on that side, the Marxist side, but the globalist side is profound and is deep. If you don't believe me, look up the art at the United Nations building and look at some of it. It's profoundly creepy. Or read what Julian Huxley wrote about in his Doctrine of UNESCO in 1948 when it was founded. Or read any of Robert Mueller. They believe in as like you said, the word oneness. They believe in this idea that everything is actually all one. And if you were to use the correct occult understandings of everything, then you would understand what's really going on. So for them, Archangel Michael actually is identical to Satan. And so when they believe, this is written about by the Theosophist Helena Blavatsky, and so they believe that when you are summoning or calling Archangel Michael into being or into action or into service, which of course evangelicals don't pray to angels, so it doesn't matter for you guys, that what you're actually doing, and they actually say, the Catholics don't know this is what they're doing, is that when you call Archangel Michael into service, that what you're actually, you can't summon an angel, what you're actually summoning is Satan. And they are trying to use that energy. Everything in the occult runs on vibes. Maybe you've heard that word recently, a lot, the vibes. And so it doesn't matter if what you're doing is, unless you are extremely clear in your spiritual purpose, if you're even a little bit unclear, if you're doing things that they think are helpful to their cause that line up with the vibes, then you're strengthening the vibes. So I issued a warning that there is an entire occult layer under all of this, that's goal, just like with Marxism, is to transform humanity back into what it actually is, which is one giant collective that's back to the undifferentiated all. In fact, what they believe at the end of the day is that we actually are God. We've just forgotten it. And that when we eliminate all division between one another, doesn't this sound like communism? When we eliminate all division from one another, then what we're actually going to remember is that we are actually God. And so, in fact, in the occult versions of these beliefs, they believe that man, there's the Trinity, the three persons of the Godhead are Father, or the undifferentiated all, mind, or the Son, so Christ is the mind of God, and then below that is man. Man is the third person of the Godhead. And so the first spiritual task that man is supposed to undergo is to awaken to the truth of who he is, which is that he is as God. And so when you remember that you are God, which it describes sometimes in a 7-part process and sometimes otherwise, when you remember that you're God, then you can arrange yourself. This is where discernment's so important, because if you're on the internet, you've heard this term recently too. Then you can ascend yourself. Once you realize that you're truly God, you can ascend yourself from the third person of the Godhead to the second. You can achieve a Christ consciousness. Christ consciousness is not a Christian concept. Christ consciousness is this idea that there's a higher plane of consciousness that's having attained the mind of God. And it's called Christ consciousness because Jesus is said to have been one such person who attained it. It is a completely different belief. And then when there are enough teachers who have achieved Christ consciousness to bring mankind back into full oneness, when he realizes, as the Pope recently put on Twitter, that all of the religions are paths to the same truth, then we can all come back into the undifferentiated all and enter back into the perfect pleroma, or the heavenly state of oneness with God, which is what it actually means when they say we are all one. And this is a deep, fundamental, philosophical assumption behind the United Nations, and in twisted, man-centered form, it is the assumption behind Marxism. Now, I'm again speaking a little out of turn, but I fundamentally believe that it's because it is the fundamental lie of Satan that it animates both schools of thought. But if you don't know that I didn't get into all this because at some point it's like, James, this is weird. But this is the actual spiritual battle going on. At the deepest level, this is the spiritual battle going on, is that there is a side that believes that we are as God or are gods ourselves who have forgotten our inheritance, that need to reawaken to what it is and assert it on our own terms by first realizing who we are, then doing the work to transform our consciousness. Remember, Marx said a positive transcendence of private property is human self-estrangement. We have to achieve that. That's socialist consciousness or Christ consciousness. And then after that, when that's sufficiently achieved, then we can all merge back into the undifferentiated all that is God, and history ends and everything's perfect all over again. And this is an eschatological faith. It is a doomsday cult, as a matter of fact, and it is also, by its very design, not just built entirely on satanic pride, but it's a death cult. Because the whole point is that we have to shun our individuality, and at the end of the day, the first and last thing you own is your body. This is a very evil thing that we're all fighting against. Communism is just kind of a surface level of it, honestly, as bad as that is. And like I said, this is the philosophy behind the biggest players of the United Nations. Robert Mueller, who I mentioned, who created Common Core. Actually, that's not true. He created World Core curriculum for the United Nations, which was adopted by the Council of Governors in the United States as Common Core a number of years ago, 2 decades ago about, something like that, 2010-ish. Common Core curriculum by Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller wrote an extensive amount of stuff right before the turn to the year 2000, so in the late 90s. He wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of ideas for the future of the United Nations, and he explicitly said again and again in these that what we have to do is let the United Nations take control of the full evolution of humanity. It's going to be an evolution based in cooperation. It's not going to be an evolution based in competition anymore. Darwin is out. We're going to be a cooperative, and we're going to become one complete planetary organism whose central nervous system is located in the brain of the United Nations. And that's complete tyranny. And they believe, I'm not joking, that the internet allows the interconnectivity of human thought from one person to another to actually fulfill this evil vision, which obviously it would if we were all asleep and just letting the internet program us instead of being awake enough to be discerning to tell. So like never before has I send you out among ravening wolves. You need to be as gentle, or as wise as serpents and gentle as doves, like really been pertinent. But I mean, that's not a great summary. I didn't really expect to talk about occultism. I haven't talked about it a whole lot in the last little while. But there is a lot going on with totally whack job occult religion that actually lies underneath this. And it's trying to pull Christianity into perversion to believe in those lines. Like I just said, like you can look that up. The Pope just tweeted that a couple of weeks ago, that all religions are pathways to the same truth or something to this effect. And that's what I told you in the talk, that their goal is every religion's going to be maintained, but every religion's going to falsely worship so that all worships the same thing. Because they believe they know the fundamental and total truth, and it's their job to use whatever they can, including your faith, to twist you into those values. So, sorry to darken that mood, but that's what's really going on. So, yeah, real important to try to be very spiritually clear in what you consume and what you interact with.
So my question has to do with, you mentioned that communism or progressive ideas are cultish. They find their source of truth within the human heart, the human brain. Christianity, Judaism finds its source of truth external from itself. And listening to people on podcasts, Joe Rogan, I think I heard that you were on his podcast. He's one that has always been more of an agnostic in any way. But even people like that are starting to speak of, they're seeing the error and the bad side of this progressive movement, but they're talking about open to this spiritual idea. So from a perspective, a Christian perspective, in a public square with people who are talking about spiritual, just from your experience, how have you worked with those? Because it's still kind of competing ideas of a source of truth external to ourselves and working with people who are still looking within themselves. And how do you navigate that?
I mean, I see this happening a lot, and I think it's actually, that ties very tightly, not to the full occult thing, but the last thing that I said in the previous response I gave, I think is extremely important, which is the demand for spiritual clarity. I sometimes come and tell audiences, not necessarily for this kind of a talk, but if I talk about education, or I talk about what's going on with the queer theory side of things with the children, that parenting is on hard mode right now. It's much harder to be a parent than it was when I was a kid. You've got to be way more engaged, way more involved. You've got to make way bigger sacrifices. You can't trust the school. I was thinking earlier today that it's actually a little bit crazy that we ever decided to trust the school for 40 hours a week or whatever with our kids without us being there. But anyway, parenting's way more full on now. Well, the same thing is actually true. There's no more spiritual cruise control, right? So I see this environment that you're asking about, and I see a lot of people who are either new to spiritual ideas or especially Christianity. They're dabbling in it, or they've just converted or just taken it up or whatever. And since I'm very forthright, I'm specifically thinking of Russell Brand at this moment, who I don't think, even whether this conversion is genuine or not is always an open question, but that's beside the point. He's not in a position where for any reason, and I think it's biblically grounded, that there's no reason that this man should be sitting on stage giving spiritual advice to anybody if he converted 6 weeks ago. And so what I would say is that this need for spiritual clarity in this environment is extraordinarily high, because there are a lot of people who will take these ideas, and again, like I said, discernment is the difference between right and almost right. They'll take these ideas and they start playing with them, and they mix them with other spiritualist ideas that they have. Russell Brand is one. Jordan Peterson's a known Jungian who's now gone kind of full into this direction, and everybody's religious, and there's no such thing as atheism, and a lot of people are praising him, but there's this mixture of like Jungian. Jung had the largest collection of Gnostic texts of anybody in history. Why is that? Was Jung a Gnostic? Might be. So, as Charlie Kirk once told me, James, never get your theology from Jordan Peterson. He called me out because he asked me what I thought about something. I told him, he's like, you got that from Jordan Peterson. Charlie just knew. Don't get your theology from Jordan Peterson. I was like, all right, Charlie. And I'm just being very forthright, so when this goes on the internet, I'm going to get burned to the ground. But the fact of the matter is that we've got to be extremely, you guys have got to be, we've all got to be extremely clear. People who are opening up now need way more grounded, clear, biblical understanding if they're opening up to Christianity, so they don't get sucked into some weird enneagram or whatever it is thing that's all popular right now. You have this kind of very rapidly opening, kind of mass opening of hearts, I guess, to Christian belief, and this is a spiritual battle, and this matters, good versus evil, and there's so much opportunity for people to get pulled off into bad stuff. And so there's a word for this that's not very popular in a lot of circles, at least in my circles that I run into on the internet, which is what's required is gatekeeping, or as you guys call it as Christians, being a good shepherd. So this is a high call for people who are grounded in a well-developed and much more mature Christian faith to step in and say, hang on, let's make sure you get it right. Calling people out in public probably isn't going to do a lot. Ask me how I know. But saying, hey, hang on, let's get you some legs under you before you just start running off. If you're interested, here's what you need to do. Like, you need to find a good church. You need to attend for a while. You need to talk to some people. You need to grow in your faith. There's a lot of movements where there are a lot of people who are new converts to a lot of things, primarily different Christian religions, including Catholicism, who, to my perception, as best as I can tell, have a theology roughly as deep as a mud puddle. But they have, we'll call it, vigor or brimstone equal to a volcanic eruption. And that's a very dangerous spiritual situation for a population to be in. And what it calls for is the guidance of elders. What it calls for is the guidance of mature faith. And so the need for spiritual clarity, I would almost advise people who are less sure to not get directly involved than to just dive in the morass of the internet right now, because it is a real mess. Spiritual clarity, and then the willingness of people who have that to take the very courageous action, let me assure you, of gatekeeping. This is not correct. If you want to learn what's correct, come study. We're happy to help, blah, 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 what churches were always meant to be. And I think this is a very important thing for people to realize, that you're more likely now than at any time in the last probably 30 years, unless you watch Oprah Winfrey all the time, to get junk Christianity shoved on you and get taken off your path than you have been. It's a very spiritually vulnerable situation, as well as a very big spiritual opportunity for the nation.
In the movie, there was a stained glass from the Fabian Socialism. How does that play into the world stage?
Yeah. So the Fabians. So this is a nice, easy question that doesn't require me to talk for 45 minutes, I promise. So there's a society in England that was founded in 1844 called the Fabian Society. It was an offshoot of an occult group called I think it was called the Fellowship for New Life. As soon as you hear that, you're like, that's probably bad. The Fellowship for New Life was an occult group that was trying to summon a new age of man with a completely reborn spiritual man, blah, blah, blah. And they had a spin-off called the Fabian Socialists, or Fabian Society, which incorporated, like I said, in 1844. George Orwell wrote a book about the idea that the Fabians grew in power for a century, culminating in their totalitarian strength in the year 1984 that you've probably heard of. It's called 1984. So you know a lot about them. The totalitarian government in that novel is called INGSOC, I-N-G-S-O-C. INGSOC is an abbreviation for English Socialism, and it refers to the Fabians. So you have a sense of what their ideas are anyway. If you want to find out how deliciously awful the Fabians were, you should look up, one of their founders was George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, My Fair Lady. You should look up the following on YouTube when you get a chance. George Bernard Shaw, and then the following words: there are an extraordinary number of people I would like to kill. It's about a 2-minute video. Your jaw will hit the floor. It's unbelievable what they say. So the Fabians had a completely different model of communism, but they are communist, a completely different model of communism to the Soviets. Their model was incrementalist, gradualist, secret infiltration. Their idea was, we'll get one more person on the parliament, one more person on the county commission, one more person, one more person, one more person, and then we'll take over from within. There will be no bloody revolution like in Marxism. And then we're going to have a perfect communist system. Their crest, their coat of arms, which is what you were referring to in the movie. Yeah, there you are. I saw you going by. I lost you. The coat of arms is literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. That's what they chose for themselves, a wolf in sheep's clothing. I saw the stained glass, by the way. I went to the George Bernard Shaw Library in London, which is normally nobody's allowed in. We accidentally crashed a funeral and got to see it. But I saw the Fabian window myself. It's a stained glass window they made of themselves. And there it has the wolf in sheep's clothing above the earth, which is heated to red hot and on an anvil with George Bernard Shaw and Sidney Webb beating it with hammers to remold it into whatever shape they desire. That's actually what it says, is remold it to thine heart's nearer to thine heart's desire across the top. Shatter it to bits, heat it, and remold it nearer thine heart's desire. It comes from a poem. And so their goal was to infiltrate institutions and transform from within. And their signature tactic, everything that you've dealt with has fingerprints of Fabianism all over it. Keir Starmer in two-tier Keir in London is a Fabian. The Labour Party was partially founded and heavily supported by the Fabians all along. The London School of Economics is Fabian. This is a Fabian Society educational institution. They deliberately infiltrate both parties to create the illusion of democracy, an illusion of contest. If it sounds like rhinos, an illusion of contest so that the main agenda keeps moving forward while people fight over stuff that looks like there's two sides when there's actually just one side. That's their mode of operation. And they're one of the most influential organizations in the world. The Fabians paid to bring how did the neo-Marxists, the critical theorists, get to the United States, the Frankfurt School in the first place? Fabian Society helped them do it, I think also with Rockefeller money. So this is one of the most influential organizations that very few people have ever heard of. If you want a very long and detailed read about them, there's a book about them called The Fabian Freeway that you can read. And like I said, they basically govern England right now. So if you want to know what Fabian governance looks like, look at what they're doing in England right now and you'll get a taste. And they have definitely significantly infiltrated both parties of the United States as well. It's a major, major problem. I won't get into naming any of that names or any of the details because I'm not actually 100% sure about some of it. But a lot of people are very aware, for example, that Mr. Reagan's administration made a lot of very good decisions and a few very odd decisions that seemed to increase tyranny rather than increase freedom in the United States. And there's very strong reasons to believe that there were Fabian plants who were intentionally advising Ronald Reagan to make those incorrect decisions. So the infiltration into the United States, and including the Republican Party, is not trivial. Of the Fabian Society. So it's a very significant organization. But again, wolf in sheep's clothing is literally the symbol they chose for themselves. So if you wonder if you're out among ravening wolves and you need to be as wise as serpents and gentle as doves, you most certainly do.
We got time for just a few more here, so.
I have a younger sister who, if there was a queen of wokeism, she'd be in the running. For somebody that's not as well read as she is and has trouble with combative conversations, what are some resources that you would suggest to research to improve my knowledge, to talk to her, or ways to combat that?
Well, if she's working on, I have bad news. That if she's in the running for Queen of Wokeness, like I said in my remarks, and this is, I'm gonna be a little bit blunt, your sister has been pulled into a cult. And you're going to have conversations about these issues with around any issue involving cult doctrine with somebody that's been pulled into a cult don't typically go smoothly, no matter how much you know about the cult. The whole point of the cult is to create, and this is an intentional word that has to do with occult thinking, not a cult, but a cult, like we've been talking about already, is to create a hermetically sealed environment in which no idea can challenge the cult's doctrine. Hermetic refers to, or hermetically sealed refers to hermeticism, which is a form of magical transformation in the occult. So this is, I mean, we do use the word hermetically sealed in a neutral way too, but that's actually where it comes from. And it refers to Hermes, the Greek messenger god who is known to be a trickster, and we won't identify him as being akin to Lucifer or anything like that, because, okay. Your sister's in a cult. You're not going to have successful conversations around this issue until something causes her to ask you questions that you can provide the answers to, and you probably will not require very much education to provide those answers. Somewhere she's got to get that kind of cross-eyed moment where the cult belief system and reality don't line up, and you can see her brain kind of go out of focus. And then she asks the question, well, what would your answer to this be? Or why do you think this is happening? And then if you tell her a minimal amount, it might go well, and if you tell her more than that, it won't go well. It's virtually impossible to get inside of a cult belief system because her sense of self, if she's in a cult, is tied up in maintaining that belief. The idea with a cult is that your belief that you are a worthy person is completely tied up in the fact that you uphold what's in the cult. That said, I wrote a book with a friend of mine named Peter Bogosian, who actually lives near here, although he's not here right now. So maybe he's local and you guys could connect with him at some point. But Peter and I wrote a book called How to Have Impossible Conversations in 2019. That advice, I was told tonight, actually, is useful. It's not terribly hard to read. In fact, it's fairly easy to read. You might pick up a copy of that and check it out. You aren't going to learn anything about woke in there, but you will learn a lot about how to approach a conversation with somebody who's in a deeply entrenched position and maybe change their mind. What I recommend, honestly, when you have a family member is that trying to reach them and change their mind. Unfortunately, you are in one of the worst positions to do that. Our psychology says that the closer you are, the more influence you can have, but it works out that it's not that way. The closer you are to the person, the less able you are to reach in most cases. A stranger is more likely to say something that shakes her up than you can. And I'm not sure why that is. And I say that with my own difficulties in my own family with woke people too. I mean, I'm not immune to this problem. I don't have magic bullet answers to any of this. What you need to do is be her brother. What you need to do is tell the truth, of course. Let her know honestly where you stand in a non-combative way, and that it has nothing to do with your love for her or your relationship with her, and that you're available to talk anytime she wants. You're not here to try to change your mind. You'd be happy if you did, but that's not your goal. And you are a resource in any way that a brother can be a resource at any time, and then unfortunately endure the situation that you're in with it and hope that she takes you up on your offer. The best thing that you can do is to be that loving landing pad and make it clear that you're not compromising on your beliefs, but that it's no judgment on her as your sister, even if she doesn't believe the same way that you do, that you're still family and that's still important. Yes, of course, pray for, if you want to learn some basics of woke, it wouldn't hurt you in general. It will not help you much in this situation unless you learned enough to be able to think like they think, so that you can actually fully say, this is I could sit down with her and say, this is the way that you view this. Is this resonant with you? Do you understand? Is this how you understand this issue, and so on? But chances are, even if she fully agreed that I understood it, if I took a step out of it, she's not going to be able to listen to it. So you go to my website, which is called newdiscourses.com. There are a bajillion podcasts and articles that explain woke. There are a lot of other people out there that you might be able to find who also explain it, to find something that's the level that is useful to you. The best thing you can do is be your brother. I'm not kidding. And be a Christian in how you approach her. Loving, gracious, patient, the whole thing. I mean, we usually say it at weddings, but we all know what the list of attributes of love is. Does not boast, blah, blah, blah. We know the whole thing. I wish I had a better answer, because I'd fix my family too.
First, I want to say thanks for being a historian and having history enough to explain things in a way that most of us could understand. As we all know, end times, we're getting closer to them. We're never getting farther away from them. It's going to be more like Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's going to get uglier and uglier. So I want to talk about that pendulum you were speaking about. So when it comes back to fascism, right, what are the historical signs of that?
So there's a number of ways I could actually answer this question. The most general kind of picture would be that communism comes along and says everything in society is defunct because we have all this oppression, and this oppression is unfair, and it's created all these injustices. And then the signal that fascism is coming has been, yeah, everything is unfair and there is oppression, and that's what made everything good. So we need to do more of it. That's exactly the mentality, is everything was good until we stopped oppressing the people who have now come in and caused all of our problems. Hitler blamed the Jews. Almost every fascist has blamed whichever scapegoat, they've almost all blamed Jews, but whatever scapegoated ethnicities are in their country, some minority ethnicity that's in their country, and they almost always blame the Marxists very specifically. If you read Mein Kampf, Hitler is extremely clear that his main motivation for his antipathy was being angry at arguing with Marxists, until one day he realized every Marxist he argued with was a Jew, and then he realized that all Jews are Marxists. And that's, of course, logically incorrect. And then the Jews became the scapegoat that was preventing Germany from rising to its rightful state in the world. So the historical build that tells you that fascism is on the rise is when people start saying, yeah, you're right, there is all this oppression. They agree with the communists. There is all this oppression. But rather than it being bad and needing to flip the social order over, it's actually good, so we need to reinforce the oppressive social order with us in charge. And that's usually the signal that it's coming. Another signal that it's coming is that you will see the resistance to the leftists, the resistance to the communists, will start to take on the same identity politics as the communists, but in reverse. So critical race theory in our time, for example, obviously does not hold high regard for white people, and it's extraordinarily race conscious of all the different peoples of color and of whiteness, and you have to, check your white privilege and all of that. At some point, a signal that there's a fascist element would say critical race theory is in fact an anti-white ideology. That's the primary thing about it. So we need to assert ourselves as white people back against it. So you create that identity or ethnicity conflict back and forth. And so this is, like you said, the pendulum, but it's the pendulum swinging back somewhere different. That's not what we actually started with. I mean, they get mad, these people on the kind of radical right get mad when you invoke the 90s. But when in the 1990s, we did not think of ourselves in terms of race war. So when the pendulum comes back to race war, it didn't come back to where it started. It came back somewhere different. And it came back, in fact, exactly where the communists needed to go. Another way, it's just since we're talking about the spiritual battle, though, those are some of the historical signs. There's typically with fascists, there's also like a very military-style leader who, historically at least, who tends to rise up, a powerful, charismatic figure who is going to fix everything as long as you sacrifice some of your liberties to him to give him the power to be able to do it. He's going to get to the root causes, kind of like the vice president says, and going to uproot the actual root causes instead of trying to play around in surface level solutions or superficial fixes. Hitler was very frequent in saying we cannot resort to half measures. We have to go all the way. Half measures will not suffice. And so you're going to hear that kind of language, and what you'll hear is the accusations that other people who have been doing an effective stand-up or fight are actually just engaging in half measures, and maybe they were useful at the beginning, but they need to be gotten rid of for these more radical, hardlining, strong, powerful people who are going to actually finish the job where everybody else is too afraid or too weak to do it. That's a red flag that fascism's on the rise. And I would tell you, if you know where to look on the internet, which doesn't take very much work, that flag is waving big time with a bright spotlight on it right now. But what's really interesting in the spiritual battle realm, and I guess this is kind of how I'll wrap up, but it's not what you asked, but it's worth, since it came up, bringing up. Both communism and fascism are similar in that they're forms of idolatry. They're both idolatry of the state. But I'm going to get a little bit deep with you. I need you to understand a little bit about communism that I haven't told you yet, so you can understand this. The idea of communism is that the state becomes the Christ. The idea is that the state itself is going to heap upon itself all of the sins and then sacrifice or wither away in the end to liberate humanity. So it's going to become the intentional oppressor, so it's going to heap the sins upon itself. It's going to become the oppressor of man so that it can transform who man is. But then when man is transformed, the state becomes irrelevant, as Karl Marx says, and will wither away of its own accord. So the state in the end sacrifices itself to liberate man from a state. So the state is a Christ figure in the communist religion. You ever wondered if it's a twisted around, upside down, state-driven version of Christianity? Of course it is. Marx was a Lutheran. He actually was a Lutheran that was trained around other people who went to an occult school that claimed to be a Lutheran seminary called the Tübingen Stift. You can look up the Stift, S-T-I-F-T, if you want. You'll find that total mysticism and occultism taught under a Lutheran guise. And his dialectical stuff came from Hegel, who was a student at the Stift, who learned all of the occultism there and imported it into his philosophy and created the dialectic that Marx turned into the dialectical materialism. But I digress. So what you have to understand about communism that you haven't yet is that Marx believed that what would happen is that when the properly conscious took control of the state and they used it to use the dictatorship of the proletariat to destroy all of the infidels, so to speak, that what would happen is that the state would become unnecessary and would wither away of its own accord, and thus it's a Christ-like figure in the eschatology that they have. And then that's the liberation of man. So man gets to return into Eden by the state sacrificing itself. That's the idea. So that's an idolatry with the state taking the place of not just of God, but of specifically Christ. Fascism is actually an idolatry of the state as well, such that the state takes the role of not Christ, but God the Father. It becomes the unquestionable absolute under which all people have all of the meaning of their life. In fact, Benito Mussolini famously said that in his book called The Doctrine of Fascism, he actually said that the individual does not exist outside of the state. And he says, in fact, that the state, he says that fascism is a spiritual movement, and he says that the state gives all of the meaning to what it means to be a person. So now what you have is no longer a self-sacrificial God that's liberating humanity. You now have the state erecting itself as the Father God who's going to set the house in order. So what you're frequently going to see in a historical sense is you're going to have these strong men come along, say that you have to worship the state, and usually them as leader of the state through that, such that they're going to bind people together and that they lose all identity outside of that binding so that they can set the world back in order. But you just have to sacrifice your liberty in order to do it. If you don't know what the word fascism means, by the way, it comes from the Latin fasces, which is not feces, by the way, fasces, which means a bundle of sticks tied together. And the symbol for fascism is a bundle of small sticks tied together with an axe head coming out of it, with the idea that if you had just a flimsy stick, an individual, and you try to put an axe head on it, you couldn't do any damage. But if you tie a bunch of sticks together, it's strong enough where it won't break. And so the idea of fascism is you bind everybody together so that it won't break when it hits duress. So from a spiritual perspective, you have to realize that both of these are attacks. One is idolatry of the state, where the state is the self-sacrificial Christ that's going to liberate you. And the other is that the state is the angry, let me just be a little more blunt, angry Father God. So in communism, this is going to get me in so much trouble. In communism, the state is Jesus. And in fascism, the state is Allah. Does that make it clear? That's how this works. And everybody's going to submit, and then there will be peace. That's how this works. Also, in terms of spiritual, just to point out for the occult, because you mentioned the pendulum, that is actually one of the Hermetic principles. I mentioned vibes earlier. That's called the principle of vibration. This is called the principle of polarity. They have 7 magical principles about how the world actually works. And so the way that it's actually described in a book called the Kabbalion, which is supposed to describe Hermetic magic and how it works, is that the pendulum will swing, but the magician, the wizard, controls how long the bob is. So it might swing over here, and then they shorten it so it swings back and hits their enemy somewhere else when it comes back. So when I say that they arrange the pendulum to swing to come back and hit a target, this is deeply rooted in their literally kind of law of attraction, manifestation, Oprah Winfrey kind of religious beliefs about the laws of polarity and the laws of vibration. Also, of course, their principle of correspondence, which is the first of the principles of Hermeticism, which you've probably heard and associated it with Lucifer, or with Baphomet, which is as above, so below, as below, so above. Same set of principles, actually. And so the pendulum swinging thing at all, and the idea that you can control it to bring in a new state of affairs that works to your advantage, is considered part of their occult magic. So you can bet that the weirdo globalists who run all this do not care if they get their totalitarian control in their new transformational system through a leftist movement or through a movement pretending to be the right, which is fascist. And I say pretending, it's the right hand of the left. So the historical signs, though, are like I said, and you need to understand that it's got this very jihad-like character to it, with no idea, the only sacrifices of the individual to the state. It's complete submission to the state, and it's another form of idolatry. So, or if you want some historical signs that are more contemporary, just go on Twitter. I hate to break that bad news to you. Just go look. I would recommend you go look for people who don't like Jews. They're not hard to find. You can't throw a rock without finding hundreds of them. They're all over the place, unfortunately. So be discerning, people. If I can give you no other message, please be discerning. It is a dangerous, dangerous time. And I'm, again, eternally grateful that you let me take this time in this space with you. Thank you for having me.
Wow. Anyone else who have growing marks on your brains? Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, James. We have a lot to think about. We have a lot to process. But we hope that this was an opportunity to get some insight from someone who studied this for years and years and is saving us a lot of the hard work. But now we need to take and look at this through, if we are believers, through the lens of Scripture and through our faith, and to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Amen? Amen. All right, well, that's all for tonight. Go out, check out the books, check out the tables. Make sure to register to vote if you haven't, and make sure to vote. All right, thank you so much. Have a good night.